What's up everybody, it's Izzy, and in this video I'm going to talk about the overhead press for powerlifting. So fairly or unfairly, I sort of have a reputation as the guy who hates all accessories, never does any upper back work, and thinks that the overhead press is useless. And that's really not my position. The reason why people think that is because I criticize a lot of novice programs that people recommend for powerlifters that have you doing the overhead press and the bench in equal volumes and equal frequencies. And that's a bad idea. And the reason why that's a bad idea is that the overhead press really only loosely correlates to your bench strength. So in my experience, let's say someone only benches and they never do overhead press. That person can maybe press 40 to 50% of their best bench, and that's without ever training the overhead press. On the flip side, let's say somebody only overhead presses and never really benches. Those types of people tend to be Olympic weightlifters, and even they can still press something like 80, 85, sometimes as high as 90% of their best bench, but the bench is still higher. So if you get your overhead press to like 3 plates, of course your bench is going to go up to some degree. Now here's the issue though. If you add 10, 15 pounds on your overhead press, it might not do jack shit for your bench because again, there's only a loose correlation, and the more differences there are between, say, your overhead press grip width and your bench grip width, the less it's going to carry over, right? So in my experience, it's not a great idea to have the overhead press as an equivalent to the bench in your program. It's not a great idea to overhead press in equal frequency and volume to the bench because again, the correlation is only loose. It's kind of weak. And here's the other thing about the overhead press is that you can spend all year doing overhead press and add 10 to 15 pounds to it, right? It is the single hardest lift to get to move out of any of the barbell lifts, and that's just because, it's one of the lifts that requires the lightest weights. So 10 to 15 pounds in terms of percentages could be a huge percentage increase, right? Anyways, for powerlifting purposes though, I do like to keep the overhead press, and I think it does a few useful things. Number one is that it either restores or maintains range of motion about the shoulder joint. If you can get a barbell directly over your head, shrugged above the spine of the scapula, directly above it, you're going to be able to maintain a lot of that shoulder flexibility and mobility. Chin-ups and pull-ups have some of the same effect, but overhead press is great as well. The other thing is that, in my opinion, the overhead press is great for sheer hypertrophy, and you don't have to necessarily do it standing. You could do it seated, you could do it with dumbbells, you could do it seated with dumbbells, and in my experience, the overhead press, again, for sheer hypertrophy, you can't beat it. Now, the last reason is that, in my experience, when a lot of powerlifters bench on back-to-back days, and this is not everyone, of course, but when a lot of powerlifters bench on back-to-back days for weeks on end, they end up with pectoral tendinitis. So the overhead press can be a great way to add more pressing sessions per week, or at least one more pressing session per week, where you aren't bothering the pec tendons. You're training the triceps, you're training the shoulders with the barbell, so the specificity isn't too low, and you're getting in another press session without aggravating the pecs. So that's the 3 reasons that I like to use it. It maintains that shoulder range of motion around the shoulder joint. It is a great movement strictly for pure hypertrophy of the shoulders. And of course, the last reason is that you can get additional press days in your training program without aggravating the pec. So the last thing that I want to say is that a lot of people get caught up on doing this exercise standing, and if you're a powerlifter, I really don't think that's necessary. There's a couple drawbacks to doing it standing. The first one is that it's really easy to cheat standing presses. You can end up bending your knees and turning it into a slight push press, which makes the focus more on the triceps, or you can end up leaning back a lot and making it more of a standing incline bench. And the other issue is that even if you have good technique, the abs can sometimes be the limitation rather than the shoulders. So if you're looking for just that sheer shoulder hypertrophy, if you're looking at using the press as strictly an accessory to drive up your bench, you do not have to do it standing. And in fact, I would recommend from time to time switching it up and doing it seated or doing it with dumbbells just as a means of making sure that the abs aren't the limitation of your accessory work, right? Because you're doing it for your shoulders. Anyways, guys, that's my thoughts on the overhead press. Definitely not a useless movement for powerlifting, but if you're counting on it to drive up your bench, I think you're kind of barking up the wrong tree. You should go with something a little bit more specific. Use bench variations instead. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. As always, my friends, good luck with your training. Have a nice day. Peace.